welcome to Tabletop Tommies, episode 14. I'm Jonny.
And I'm Phil.
And today we're going to be talking about the Armies of Finland, how to use them in bolt action, why you might want to play them, and how you probably should play them if you are thinking about it from a competitive standpoint, as well as your general thematic guidelines for the types of units you should include depending on what you're trying to depict. First, I thought today we should start with a bit of history. Do you know much about the history of Finland in World War II, Phil?
A little, but it's certainly not the strongest area of my historical knowledge, no.
Me too, and I've got to be honest, until I started playing Finland, I really didn't know anything about them. And it was purely just trying to work out why they had these different units with different equipment and different names. Trying to work that out sort of led me into reading about it and what part they played in the war. So, jumping into the history, in August 1939, the Nazis and the Soviets signed a non-aggression pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, to basically divide Europe between them so that there's not a big conflict between them in 1939. They agree which land each of the two major powers can have. In November 1939, the Soviets then shell their own village, blame the Finns for it as a pretext to invade. They then invade Finland, and then you have the first conflict for Finland in World War II, the Winter War. So it doesn't go very well for the Soviets. It's quite embarrassing, to be honest. And I believe it's one of the reasons that the Nazis were very confident in 1941 when they invaded. But anyway, so the Winter War starts in November 1939. In March 1940, the Finns and the Soviets sign a treaty. In the treaty, Finland cedes 9% of their territory to the Soviet Union, but the Finns are very aware that it's just a temporary ceasefire, and so they continue arming after the treaty is signed. Then, June 1941, as I said earlier, the Nazis, buoyed by the poor performance of the Soviets in Finland, invade the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa commences. At that point, the Soviets then launch air raids on Finland, and it is the start of the continuation war.
Now, you also had German units stationed in Finland at that point. So when Barbarossa happened, when it started, there were German units attacking from Finland into the Soviet Union.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's one of the reasons as well, when we get to the units, we'll see a lot of Panzerfaust in the continuation war entries, because alongside the troops the Germans were sent to Finland, they will also send equipment.
Yeah, which would have obviously appeared down the line as the Panzerfaust was developed and mass-produced and so on, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. And then the continuation war continues basically until 1944. In September 1944, obviously, this is a very simplified version of history, but in September 1944, the Soviets aren't that interested in Finland anymore. They're really just racing to Berlin.
So the Soviets are trying to get to Berlin before the Allies, in terms of the Americans and the British and the Commonwealth units, get to Berlin, because whoever takes Berlin is going to have a greater say in post-World War II split and separation and, disarmament of the German nation. However, there's a treaty signed, isn't there, between the big three, and they basically say the Soviets can take Berlin and the Allies, the US and the British and the Commonwealth, focus on southern Germany, Austria, and that sort of stuff, and they leave Berlin to the Soviets.
And then after the war, obviously, it's then divided between the big three, isn't it?
Yeah, and you've got the whole, split in terms of, Berlin split into two, and East Berlin being occupied by Soviet forces, and East Germany being occupied by Soviet forces. Western Germany being occupied by British and American, and then Commonwealth, and all that sort of stuff. And then you get into NATO, and then we go into the Cold War, and off we go from there.
Exactly, Iron Curtain time. But dialing back the clock a little bit, back to the continuation war. So September 1944, as we said, the Soviets aren't that interested in Finland anymore. They're focused on Berlin. And so the Allies sign a ceasefire with Finland in September 1944. The Finns then fight the Lapland War against the Germans, who were previously supporting them against the Soviets, effectively. So, in summary, the Finns were very much caught between a rock and a hard place. They had the Germans to their south. They had the Soviets to their east. The Germans and the Soviets had actually agreed that the Soviets could have Finland. And the only reason the Soviets didn't completely take Finland is because the Finns put up such a strong fight, and also because they had sort of the local advantage in the winter, I think. And so the Finns managed to retain some sort of independence there. But ultimately, because they were so heavily supported by the Germans and were fighting against the Soviets, they are sort of an Axis power in bold action.
Mm-hmm.
But there are times you might see at tournaments, if someone's doing Axis versus Allies, if someone's doing a very early war Finnish army, now at that point in the war, they're not really Axis or Allies, because they're just fighting the Soviets, who actually aren't in the war yet either. They're just, the closest the Soviets are in the war is sort of that non-aggression pact with the Nazis. And so actually you could at that point in the war play the Finns as the Allies. And then obviously if you do a very late war Finnish army, sort of post-September 44, then they are fighting on the side of the Allies. So Finns are actually a really interesting one for that, where yes, they're an Axis power, but they're not hugely aligned with the Axis powers. It's very much a marriage of convenience, I would say.
Yeah, they're certainly not, one of the big three in terms of Germany, Italy, and Japan. They're very much, drawn into the war for various reasons, either because they get invaded by Russia initially, and a lot of that is to do with, historical reasons and whether, because Russia took Finland from Sweden, going right back to the beginning of, the sort of, I think it's the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. And there's a lot of to and froing politically as to whether or not Finland is a independent nation, or if it's, if it's part of Russia and that sort of thing. So, yeah, there's a lot of history as to why Finland gets drawn into things, rather than it being sitting down and becoming part of that, Axis sort of, triumvirate, or joining the Axis triumvirate in terms of Japan, Italy, and Germany.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm not sure, because I haven't read hugely into sort of the politics of Finland during the war, but one of the things I did read is they actually had field synagogues, because the Finnish army actually had Jewish soldiers fighting alongside non-Jewish soldiers.
Okay.
And so even though they're allied with Nazi Germany, it does seem that they weren't as ideologically extreme.
Yeah, sure.
And sort of highlights that sort of marriage of convenience. As I say, I haven't read huge amounts, so maybe that there was sort of greater collaboration. But it does feel like the Finns are very much just looking for the best way to survive, basically, during the war.
Yes, effectively, they're defending their own territory, aren't they, initially, with regards to the invasion from Russia. And then, when you move into the continuation war, it's then taking back ground that historically was part of what we now call Finland. And it's all about borders and shifting borders and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
And then the last bit is, the Lapland conflict was removing the Germans who were there for resource reasons.
Yeah, exactly. And again, I imagine a big part of the Lapland War is also just sort of gaining credit with the Allies as well, because obviously it's very obvious at that point which way the war's turned. And so much like, I believe the countries in South America declared war very late in the war, just so they could have a seat at the table.
Okay.
Do you know about this?
No, I don't know.
I can't remember exactly which country it is, but there's a few countries, I believe, in South America who just declared war like 1944, 1945. Obviously, at that point, it's too late for them to get their troops abroad. But they did it just so they could sort of have a seat at the table and for sort of like diplomatic reasons, etc.
Okay.
Which is quite interesting. And I feel that the Lapland War is very similar to that, in that not only are there sort of like military strategic reasons to do it, I think there's also sort of a big political reason to sort of switch sides as well. So I think, having covered the history, that should help us when we're talking about the actual units. But first, before we get to units, I think it'd be worth talking about the national characteristics.
So the Finns have three national characteristics, and which you often see four, don't you, with some of the major powers, but it's three with Finland. So we start with Sisu. And what this means is when a Finnish infantry or artillery unit is reduced to 50% or less of its starting strength, the remaining models in that unit are automatically upgraded to a higher quality. So inexperienced become regular become vets, and veteran units increase their base morale to 11, becoming super vets. So the example in the book is when a unit of 9 regular Finnish infantry is reduced to 4 men or below, the men immediately upgrade to veterans before any more dice are rolled. And that's significant, isn't it, Jonny, when it comes to the numbers you put in your unit in order to trigger this special rule as early as possible during the game?
Absolutely, yeah. There's two key points with this. The first one actually is just a rules clarification, which is that normally an 11 would be an automatic fail on a morale test or an order test. But because the Finns have this special rule, It's actually in the FAQ that for the Finns, their morale does go to an 11, and an 11 would be a pass.
Okay.
If the numbers balance out. So say, for example, if you've got veterans with 1 pin and then a first lieutenant next to them, now that would be, you'd be testing at 11, wouldn't you? For a normal army, that 11 would still be a fail. And that's on page 43 of the rulebook, I believe, where it says maximum and minimum morale.
Okay.
But in the FAQ, that's modified to basically say that this special rule trumps the core rules. And so if you do have a Finnish veteran squad that's 50% strength, their morale's 11, they will pass a test on an 11 in that sort of situation where they've got 1 pin, but then they're boosted by your officer.
Okay. The Finns are the spinal tap of bolt action then, because they do indeed go up to 11.
Exactly, yeah. They do it. They turn it up all the way to 11.
Nice one.
And then the second point, which is what you were talking about there, absolutely, the number of men is a huge thing you consider when you're building Finns because let's say you go from 6 men to 7 men. So at 6, if you lose 3 men, you go up a veterancy. So your regulars become veteran, let's say. At 7, you lose 3 men, you haven't gotten a veteran yet. You have to lose the 4th man to go to veteran. And so you're losing more than 50% of your squad before you get that benefit.
Yeah.
And so what I find is most Finnish players will take even numbers of men in their squads. So 6, 8, 10. And that's purely just because, as I say, otherwise you're having to wait until another man dies before you get that benefit. But you've paid points to do that, if you see what I mean.
No, that makes sense.
It's a brilliant rule, though. It does mean that you basically get a little upgrade. So if your regulars are on an objective, they're starting to get pinned out, they're starting to take casualties. Once they get down to half strength, they become veterans and they become harder to shift. And I've had that exact situation happen where I've had veterans, well, I think it was a regular squad originally, sat in hard cover, and they're just getting harder and harder to kill, and just really frustrating someone.
Kind of like, the opposite of the Italians, isn't it?
Yeah,
the more Italian units die, the worse their morale gets. But actually, the more models that die for Finns in a unit, the better they get.
Oh, yeah.
So the second one is trained huntsman, and this reflects, both the sort of, employment and also leisure activities of the Finns. They were expert marksmen. So this has 2 parts to it. So the first one is that as long as any Finnish infantry unit has an ambush order die next to it, it can re-roll morale checks. And then secondly, when the unit opens fire from an ambush, all models in the unit that are armed with a rifle, which includes snipers, gain an additional +1 to hit bonus.
This is a huge one. So in terms of your army build, one of the things you'll see is with Finns, generally you won't see a lot of SMGs unless the squad's specifically built for combat because of this rule. Because by taking SMGs, you lose this rule because it's only your rifles that are getting the +1 to hit. And so generally what you want to do is you want to build your squads fully rifle, or if you've got a squad that you're determined will be a close quarter squad, then you can give them all SMGs. But actually with the Finns, when we get to the unit entries, there's quite a few who can just have tough fighter. And so actually you don't necessarily have to make that choice. You can have the best of both worlds.
Okay.
And then the other important point on that one is the reroll morale checks. Gives you a really interesting decision. I was thinking about this earlier where, let's say I've got a squad on an objective and I put them in ambush because I know your engineers are coming at me. Now, if you put 4 pins on me with your flamethrower, there's a good chance I'm going to fail that morale check.
Yep.
And so if I've got 8 men and they're going to be hitting you on 2s, it's probably worth me opening fire. However, there's probably situations, like for example, if I have 4 pins or 5 pins on me, where actually the reroll morale checks, because I'm going to be hitting you on 6s, maybe 7s in that situation.
Yep.
The reroll morale checks might be better because I'm not going to kill your flamethrower unit. If you get the hit, if I've got 5 pins, there's a strong chance. Well, I've got 5 pins before you flame me. There's a very strong chance I'm going to fail that morale check. And so actually in that situation, it might be worth me retaining the ambush, taking the flames, and then trying to reroll my morale check. But I imagine most of the time you're going to trigger the ambush because the +1 to hit from ambush. But it is an interesting decision to make on the fly.
And I guess before you even get to that point, there is a lot of thinking involved as to whether or not you want to use an advance order, for example, to take a shot as part, at the end of your movement, as opposed to not shooting and therefore being able to put them in ambush, waiting for the opportunity later on in that turn to fire with that +1.
Absolutely, yeah. And this is the reason why I personally believe Finns are one of the best, competitively, they're one of the best armies in the game.
Mm-hmm.
But the reason we don't see them that often at the top tables is because they're also one of the hardest armies to play.
Okay.
Because you really have to be on it for stuff like that. Because there'll be times, if let's just say you said, it's always best to go in ambush. So you put a unit in ambush and then the enemy don't come near you and just plink you with howitzers. And so you've got to know, you've got to basically build that experience so you know when's the best time to advance, when's the best time to ambush, etc.
Okay, cool. So the last one is Motti. I'm going to go with Motti.
Yeah, Motti.
Okay. And this reflects basically the Finns' ability to encircle and to get around the sides and even around the rear of the enemies that they're fighting. So in game terms, what it means is when outflanking, Finnish infantry units ignore the -1 modifier to the order test for coming onto the table.
Another brilliant rule. This one I really like because it's incredibly thematic. During the Winter War, one of the things the Finns are famous for is sort of using the terrain, sort of being familiar with sort of existing in the winter, hunting in the winter. And so this very thematically sort of represents how good they are at using the terrain to their advantage and sort of skiing cross-country, etc. And obviously also it's not a game-changing, like, auto-win every game national rule from a competitive standpoint, but it is a nice little perk.
Okay.
Especially when paired with one of the units we'll talk about in the infantry section that have an interesting little special rule for outflanking.
And it's not a unique rule to the Finns because you get units like commandos, don't you, in Chindits that have
behind enemy lines.
Behind enemy lines, for example. Yeah. But obviously it is unique because it is an army special rule rather than just being unit specific.
Yeah. There might be one or two others, but yes, it's very rare. I think do the partisans have something similar where they also obviously know the land very well, and I think they have a similar rule as well.
Infiltration. You're right, infiltration.
Oh, so the partisans do have it.
Yeah, so partisans get the infiltration rule, which is also that you ignore the -1 modifier to the order test for coming onto the table when outflanking. But, pretty unique.
Yeah, it is. So there's two that we know of that have it, basically. As we said, other units do have it as a unit-specific rule, but usually you pay a point for that, whereas the Finns are getting it just as a universal rule. And as I say, it's not going to win you the game automatically. It can be hugely to your benefit, but again, as I said earlier, this is one of the reasons Finns are really good, but only if you know how to play them well.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Any other thoughts on the national characteristics, Phil, or should we dive into the actual units?
No thoughts at the moment. I'm interested to see, having played against Finns a few times, I'm interested to see how the national rules interact with some of the units that I've come across, because there are a lot of specific synergies, aren't there, between the units and the national rules. And like you say, if you have to think about it when you're building your list, arguably a lot more than maybe when you're building other nation lists, in order to maximize the benefits.
Absolutely, yeah. And I probably should have said at the beginning of the episode, I took the Finns to Beachhead, I think it was 22.
Yes.
Because I'd built a Finnish army to use as my sort of thematic, non-competitive tournament army. And I took them to Beachhead, and I won Beachhead with them. And the reason they did really well was exactly that. The synergy, that had a dice cap as well, of 14 dice, which I think was very helpful to the Finns. But one of the things I did after that was, after I'd won Beachhead, I actually put the Finns back on the shelf because I think they're too good for thematic play, especially if you're playing with them all the time. And so what I did was I put them back on the shelf, and I thought what I'll do is the next time I'll bring them out, I'll be out of practice with them, which will make it a little bit more, like, give me more to think about. Or the next time I'll bring them out as a competitive force rather than a thematic force. Because if you get some practice under your belt, the Finns are just a really good army in bolt action.
Beachhead 22 was very thematic, and it wasn't Swiss pairings, was it? It was jump to the left situation. So it wasn't like it was full on competitive in the way that it became more so this year when Mike changed it and moved it to Swiss pairings and whatnot. Yeah,
exactly. And this is exactly why I sort of retired them, because at those sort of tournaments, I remember I played one of the players, this is a massive tangent now, but one of the players I played had brought the 2 LVTs. He put his entire force in 2 LVTs.
Yeah.
Oh no, it's not an LVT, 2 Landing Craft. Yeah. And And yeah, and basically he had to bring his beach with him to every table because obviously you can't put them on land.
That's right. Yeah.
And I played him, and it was a brilliant game. Like, it was a lot of fun, but it was a bit one-sided because obviously I had the Finns, and he'd brought this army where he'd spent something like 200 points on these 2 transports that can't even move across the table.
Yeah.
And so I thought this actually feels not so much not in the spirit of the thematic play, but if you've taken the Finns and they are really strong and someone's deliberately taken not very strong stuff, it does create a bit of a mismatch.
It was a great looking army, to be fair. I do remember that one. The US Marine was on. It was really good.
It was brilliant. Yeah, it was a really good game as well. The person I was playing, he had his son with him, I believe,
right.
and his son was really into it. And it would actually really sped the game up as well because his son did all of the order dice pulls and like a lot of the dice rolls for him, which meant that actually we were never waiting for an order dice. It was brilliant. But shall we jump into units?
Yeah, so I guess we'll do what we often do and run through the different sections. And obviously, Johnny, you've played the Finns, I haven't, so I'll ask you the questions.
Perfect.
So HQ units, anything to note, or is it just your normal standard that you'd expect to see?
Yeah, so you've got, I'll go in reverse order. You've got an artillery observer who you'll take for fun, but I don't think anyone's competitively buying an artillery observer, but regular veteran, same points as usual. You've got a medic, can be taken regular for 25 points. Again, if you want a medic, you'll take one. Nothing of note there.
Yeah.
The officers, much like the Germans, because they're well trained, you can't take them inexperienced.
Okay.
And so you're limited to regular and veteran officers. So that's one of those cases where I think using the 2 additional men and an intelligence officer to make yourself a regular 4-man squad for sort of about 100 points would actually be really good with the Finns. And also, it gives you an opportunity later in the game to sort of push that first dice advantage.
Yes, it's worth noting, obviously, when the book was released, which was one of the early ones, things like the chaplain and the intelligence officer hadn't appeared. And because they are now genuinely generic across all nations, you can include an intelligence officer and a chaplain with the Finns if you want to. Yeah.
Generally, your builds, you're going to be seeing either a second lieutenant with a buddy regular, or you're going to be seeing that 4-man squad.
Yeah.
Those would be my 2 recommendations for that. But that's about all of note in there.
Okay.
Any other thoughts on HQ, Phil, before moving to infantry?
No, it's fairly standard, isn't it?
So in infantry, you've got 2 different units that are very similar. You've got Winter War and Continuation War. That basically the Winter War squad, I'd say only take them if you are doing a Winter War themed army, because effectively they're very similar in loadout to the Continuation War, but you lose your Panzerfaust. So the Winter War, you can have, the NCO can have an SMG, or one soldier can have an LMG. So actually that's an interesting one where you've got a choice between an SMG or an LMG.
Okay.
Now in the Continuation War, you can have one soldier with a submachine gun and the NCO with a submachine gun. So you can actually have one additional submachine gun in there, and you can take the light machine gun as a separate. To be honest, with both of these, I wouldn't recommend taking submachine guns or light machine guns. I would just take them with rifles, either 6 or 8 men. Now, where it gets interesting is both of these squads can be tough fighter for 1 point per model.
Yeah.
And so that is a really good build, especially if you've got sort of 20 points left. If you've got 3 6-man squads, making them all tough fighter makes them really hardy. So as I was saying earlier, when they're on an objective and you're losing men and they're getting harder to kill because they've gone up to veteran or they've gone from veteran to super veteran, at that point, the opponent might be thinking, oh, I'm going to have to charge them here. And so having tough fighter can be that perfect sort of last-ditch defense that you've got.
I'm just looking at the entry. I do love the fluff. When it's talking about anti-tank options, and it's talking about birch logs and how they'd often run up to the vehicles and jam the log into the vehicle's tracks, whilst then lobbing in Molotov cocktails and explosives and all sorts to try and get the crew to disembark or blow them up internally. It's great.
One of those things, isn't it? Because actually you don't have to destroy a tank. You just have to disable it. And then the crew will have to abandon it if they're getting surrounded by the enemy. So
exactly, yeah.
So their other options are, both squads can take anti-tank grenades. Don't do that, it's a waste of points. But the Continuation War, as I said earlier, can take 2 Panzerfaust for 5 points each. So one of my classic builds is you take 6 men, 2 Fausts, and tough fighters. That's going to be about 76 points regular. So for 76 points, you've got 2 Faust, tough fighters, and then when they go down to 3 men, they become veteran. And so that's a really tough little squad for you there.
Okay. My pause there was 6-man regular units. I was like, oh, but obviously they do get the benefit when they get to 3 of becoming vets. But yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, I have run them. So I think at Beachhead, because of the dice limit, I believe I did run them as veteran, which is going to cost you about 94 points. So you've got 6 veterans, 2 Fausts, and when you get them down to half strength, their morale goes up by 1.
Yeah.
Even at veteran, they're still a very cheap, tough squad. The final option on both those squads, just so you know, are skis. So for 1 point a model, you can take skis, and the skis allow you to ignore movement penalties for snow and other winter conditions. However, I don't think you'd ever take the skis for 1 point a model, because every winter table you ever see is snowy in its entirety. And so if you played that as rough ground for everyone, most of the armies can't take skis.
Yeah.
And so it would make such a bad game for the person who wasn't playing Finns. Additionally, the other reason I think you would never, unless sort of you created a specific campaign where also the Soviets were also taking skis, let's say, or had the option to. The other problem is your officer can't take skis.
Right, okay. Yeah.
And so even if you pay the 1 point per model, your officer can't keep up.
Yeah, he's running around at the back going, wait for me, guys. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think the best advice is just to do what everyone does anyway, which is when you play on these winter tables, you just treat all the open fields with snow on them as open ground, don't you?
As open ground, yeah, sure. So that's your 2 sort of standard rifle squads, your Winter War and your Continuation. The main difference being the Panzerfaust for the Continuation War.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So as I said, take the Continuation War if you're just looking for general. If you're building a generic reinforced platoon, you just want general riflemen. Continuation War is where it's at. Now, if you're taking veterans and you plan sort of a close assault, you've got this next squad, which is so I believe it's pronounced Jackery, or what would be called sort of Jagers in the German army.
Yeah.
And it actually says in the book Jagers as well. So what they are is they're basically sort of your really experienced troops, and so they're very good at sort of like recon and behind enemy line type missions. And so in that squad, any soldier can have a submachine gun for 3 points a model. Again, you can have your Faust, you can have your anti-tank grenades, you can have your skis or bicycles, and they can be tough fighter for 1 point a model. So really, the reason to choose this one over the Continuation War squad would be for the SMGs. If you really wanted a squad to sort of, I don't know, go in the outflank in a transport, jump out the transport and hose someone down, this is the squad for you. If you're just looking for riflemen, then actually no different to the Continuation War squad, are they?
No, and obviously they're limited to being veterans as well.
And so, I mean, I have ran this unit entry, but actually the reason I run it is because when I painted my Finns up, I sort of kit bashed it using the German sprues and the Soviet sprues. And then I had some Germans in, I can't remember what uniform it was, but whichever uniform I thought fitted the Finns closest. And then I had some Germans in, what's the one that the Waffen SS have? You know, the big triangle top that they use as a poncho and a tent?
Zeltbaum.
Yeah, exactly. So I had some of those sprues lying around, and I used them to build up some Finns, which I don't think is historically accurate, to be honest. But I thought it looked really cool to have them sort of with their sort of whitewashed ponchos to blend into the terrain.
Yeah.
And purely just to differentiate the squads, I used one of them as a Jackery squad, just to differentiate them in my list effectively.
Okay, so we're not taking them. Is that basically what we're saying? Unless it's very specifically for a close assault unit when we want the SMGs and the extra shots. Yeah,
exactly. So if you're taking this squad, you're taking it for the SMGs to put in the outflank to clear objectives at point blank. But equally, any tough fighters, sort of veteran tough fighter Finns, are going to be quite good. It's a shame they can't have fanatic action because one of the big perks would be in close quarters, your regulars going down to half strength then become veterans. And so if they were fanatic, that would be really nice to fight to the last man, getting harder and harder to kill. Because that has happened. I've had that where we've drawn, but in that first round of combat, someone's knocked my regular troops down to half strength, which has made them veteran for the second round of combat, which is really helpful.
Yeah.
And then you've got 2 other choices. The next 2, I'd say, are potentially the best 2, but swinging all the way back to the start of the conversation, they're only the best two if you use them in a certain way. And so these are the two that have really powerful rules, but only once you've got sort of the experience under your belt. So when I first started playing Finns, I tried both these, and to be honest, I thought they were a bit rubbish. But let's jump in so we can see what I'm talking about. So the first one is the Sissy Recon Squad. Anyone can have a submachine gun. They can have a light machine gun. They can have anti-tank grenades. They can also have skis, and they can be tough fighter. So of all of those options, I'd say the only one you should take is the tough fighter, because their special rule is Master of the Hunt. Instead of paying 13 points a model, you're paying 14 points a model, because they can actually advance and then flip the dice to ambush.
Yeah.
Which is a really powerful rule, because you've got that perk for shooting rifles from ambush. So as you were saying earlier, where you have to make that decision, do I advance or do I ambush? Well, this squad can do both.
But they can't shoot on the advance order. That's the important thing to note.
Exactly, yeah. So they just use the advance to move and then get themselves into ambush. But that's not a huge problem, to be honest, because even if they don't shoot, if we're playing something like double envelopment, let's say, if I'm just rolling them forward every turn, and then you're not wanting to walk into my ambush, yes, I'm not getting to shoot you, but actually I'm keeping that flank clear for them to just keep rolling and eventually get me 2 or 3 points at the end of the game.
Sure. No, that makes sense.
Yeah, one of the things I've seen people do is take submachine guns on these. Absolute waste of points if you do that, because you're paying 14 points a model to advance into ambush, and then you're losing your +1 to shoot from ambush by taking the submachine gun. So I'd strongly recommend not taking submachine guns on them. Just run them with rifles and potentially with tough fighter, because then they're really hard to shift. Because the big thing to remember as well is you can go down from ambush. That's the other reason they're so powerful. Because if you are trying to get on an objective, normally you're waiting until the end of the turn to rush that objective, because the problem is if you rush on early, people have got ages to just keep shooting you, haven't they?
Yeah. I'm confused as to... Sorry, just to jump back a bit. I don't know why you would take CC Recon squads and give them all SMGs when you can do the same with the Jakari squads, which cost you 1 point less because you're not paying for Master of the Hunt.
Yeah, and so I think the reason people are doing it is because what you could do is, if you're in the middle of the table approximately and you're behind a forest, what you could do is advance into that forest and then sit yourself in ambush so that when the enemy charge you, you can then shoot them with your submachine.
With your SMGs.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, okay. And you can't take Panzerfaust with Sissy Recon squads either.
Exactly. So that was what I was about to say. I rarely run them because of that reason. So I rarely run Sissy Recons because without Panzerfaust, it means they are specifically an anti-infantry unit. And so generally, I'll run the continuation squads as sort of an all-rounder.
Yeah.
Because throw a couple of Fausts in there, it's keeping the tanks back. Because the problems with the Sissy is the infantry aren't going to come near you because you're in ambush hitting on twos. But if someone just rushes them with a Steward or something, there's not a lot they can do against that.
I can see them being used, a couple of them, depending on how many units you've got. I can see them being useful as a kind of backline skirmishing type unit. So you're not going to push them forward because they haven't got the Panzerfaust, for example. But you could make good use of the fact you can advance into ambush, lock down some lanes, and prevent your opponent moving if they don't want to trigger that ambush, which will free up your other squads who have got the Panzerfaust. You pay for tough fighters on them to be pushing forward and being a bit more offensive.
Yeah, and I have ran a Finnish army where I've took 3 continuation squads and 1 bigger Sissy squad and used it exactly that way, where I think I took 3 6-man continuation squads with 2 Faust and 1 8-man recon squad. And the 8-man recon squad in most of my games was sort of in the middle of the table, just sort of rumbling forward and keeping the enemy infantry out the way, while the sort of the smaller squads were sort of working like satellite squads, sort of just keeping the tanks back. And that did work quite effectively, but it's one that you really do have to practice.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
So that's the Sissy Recon Squad. The next one is one of my favourite units in the game. It's the Kaukapartio Long Distance Recon Squad. I presume it's pronounced Kaukapartio.
Yeah.
I actually haven't asked a Finn, so hopefully we don't get too much outrage when we release this. So this squad are amazing, but are costed appropriately. So as you can imagine, very expensive.
Yeah.
Jumping through what they've got, they've got everything. So they've got submachine guns, they've got anti-tank grenades. Every man in the squad counts as a medic. They are fanatics, and they also have skis. But, oh no, sorry, they have to pay for the skis. Ugh. But their special rule is that when outflanking, they can enter from either the side of the table you've chosen, or they can enter from your opponent's own table edge. And so you're paying for this squad 23 points per model, so it's 115 points for 5 men. But you can threaten your opponent's back line. So that artillery piece, that Nebelwerfer, that heavy mortar, even something like a priest. So I played a game once where someone had a M7 priest, and because he knew the counter party would come from his table edge, potentially, and if you charge an open top transport and do any damage is destroyed, he was really worried that they'd turn up turn 3 and then charge the priest turn 4. And so what he did was he then pushed it forward away from his table edge, but that of course then meant it was close to my Panzerfaust. And I think in the end I managed to Faust it and took it out that way. But it just goes to show this is one of those units that can really force your opponent's hand. And when I've played against it, one of the things I've done is I've put units on the back line. So like an inexperienced machine gun or an inexperienced rifle squad, put that on ambush. But of course, what that means is that's great. You're kind of half dealing with the squad, but you're wasting units that are on the table to deal with something that isn't on the table.
Yeah.
And so it's a great way to force your opponent's hand.
Really good at demolition.
Yes, absolutely. And it's one of the problems with demolition because it allows outflanking. You can't do exactly this. Now, there are ways to counter it because you could just conga line down your back table edge and just keep going down and just sort of protect your objective that way. But you're absolutely right. There's times when you can steal an easy win because you get the lucky mortar hit on the squad that's behind the objective, and then your counter party will just come in from reserve and just walking up the objective.
That's another reason why demolition should not appear at events.
Yeah, absolutely. I think demolition definitely needs a tweak, doesn't it?
Yeah. Okay.
I think I'm surprised, to be honest, when we did our missions episode.
Yeah.
I was surprised that demolition had outflank because in my memory, I remembered it not having it.
Yeah, I guess to be fair to it, it's quite a good mission to maybe get people into the game, show the kind of mechanics, and it's a little bit themey and so on, but yeah, not in an event. Anyway, back to the Finns.
One more final point. If you've got 5 points left in your list, what you can do as well is you can give them rifles.
Okay.
So the reason you would do that, because obviously they've already got some machine guns, so you don't need a rifle. But if you do that, it allows them to use the +1 from ambush. You might do that. Most of the time, you're going to want those submachine gun shots because you're going to want the 10 shots rather than 5 rifle shots. But it may be that every now and then, they come in, they wipe out the artillery piece, they're really far from your opponent, sort of 18 inches away. It might be worth them going into ambush if they're on the back lines and they want to stay there for whatever reason. Put them in ambush and then they can either go down if the high explosives are coming in, or they can then have a cheeky little shot at something that runs past them. As I say, not something, not an auto include to give them a rifle, but if you've got 5 points left and you can't think of anything to spend it on, it's not a bad shout.
Now, you'd be really gutted if you were playing the Finns at an event and you bought this unit and somebody brings Bulgarians.
You would indeed. Well, this is yes, but no.
Okay.
So, yes, absolutely. It's annoying to pay for rules that you don't get to use.
Yeah.
But at the same time, because half the missions don't have outflank, you do have to think about how you're going to use these when outflank isn't in play.
Yeah, at that point, yeah.
And so because you're having to think about when outflank isn't in play, you should have a plan for if you did end up facing the Bulgarians. It is slightly annoying, but it's not the end of the world. And this is one of the reasons why I'd always say just take one of these.
Yeah.
Because one is enough to put the pressure on your opponent's back line.
Yeah.
If you took 5, you've wasted a lot of points because they're 10 points more than a normal veteran. I suppose, actually, because they've got submachine guns, they're only really 7 points more than a normal veteran. But that's still a lot of points to be paying just for that outflank rule and some anti-tank grenades and being medics. One of the things you can do with them on that note, actually, is if they're not outflanking, you can put them behind other squads and use that medic ability. Oh, sorry, you can't do that. I think the medic ability only works on the unit itself because it says, therefore the unit can self-medicate and always act exactly in the same way as if a medic was within 6. So I tend to just run them round, causing mayhem, basically, if I can't outflank them.
Okay.
And that's all the infantry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, they've only got 5 units. And to be honest, you probably could just cut it down to 4.
3, I would say, to be honest. Yeah, your Winter War, your Continuation, and your Jackery, they're very similar, aren't they? just slight variations on a theme. And then you've got your Sissy and your Kagapartio. But actually, I think that's all you need, to be honest. That's some of the best infantry in the game, I would say, short of Paragurkas.
Yeah. Yeah, nobody would take them, to be fair, would they? Anyway, so if we just quickly run through the team weapons, because it's your basic loadout, isn't it? You've got MMG, anti-tank rifle, flamethrower team, light mortar team, sniper team, medium mortar team, heavy mortar team. The interesting one, which I skipped over, is you can take a Panzerschreck team.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, you wouldn't because they're expensive, but it's interesting that you can.
Well, you might in this case. So,
okay,
as you say, skipping over the machine gun team, you're not going to take it. But if you do, you can put skis on it for 3 points, just as a note.
Nice. Okay.
Your anti-tank rifle team, that would be my usual recommended go-to. Pretty good. Now, with the Finns, if you don't take a tank, and because you haven't got engineers with a flamethrower, there is actually a place for a Panzerschreck. If you are worried about your anti-tank, generally I would run the anti-tank rifle, run it as veteran. Then if you lose, because again, that half your squad go up a veterancy level rule. If you lose your anti-tank rifle assistant, normally that would mean you count as not having your NCO, so you're at -1 morale. But if you've taken them veteran, that's going to cancel that rule out. Well, if you take them regular, it's going to cancel
it out. It's going to cancel that either way,
but effectively what it means is your morale value doesn't change when you lose your assistant, which is brilliant. And so actually a 39-point anti-tank rifle is brilliant with the Finns. You can't pay 2 points to take skis.
Which you can model on a sledge, which is pretty cool.
Very thematic, very cool. The Panzerschreck, though, you can't do that.
No.
So I assume, not worth taking because you can't have skis.
No, I'm out at that point, yeah.
But yeah, because he's 80 points regular.
Yeah.
And it's 2 men, it can be sniped.
Yeah.
And this is why you're not going to take it really. But there is a place for it, especially if you're not playing like incredibly competitively. There certainly is a place for it if you've taken lots of the recon squads over the continuation squads. So let's say you did build a 4 recon squad army with 1 Kagapartio squad, and then you've got no anti-tank basically in your infantry slots.
Yeah.
I think the Shrek might be the choice for you. But yeah, he's just too expensive, isn't he?
Yeah. I mean, it's cool. It's an iconic piece of kit, but yeah, not in terms of game mechanics. For that cost.
Yeah, I've got one and I've ran it, but he's not an auto-include for me. Flamethrower for the Finns. This is one of the few times, because normally I'm very anti-flamethrower team, but in the Finns, because you can't have flamethrowers in infantry squads, sometimes I will throw one in, because sometimes you just do need some fire, don't you, to clear a trench or something. It can have skis, this one, which is another reason why you might take it. In terms of your mortar teams, it's a bit sad. So just jumping ahead to your mortar teams.
Yeah.
It's a shame with the Finns, a bit like the officers, you can't take their mortar teams inexperienced.
Okay, yeah.
And that's my usual go-to. Normally what I would take is, rather than taking a medium with a spotter for 60 points, I'd usually take a heavy inexperienced for 46 points.
Yeah.
But with the Finns, you can't take them inexperienced.
No.
I still think the heavy is the place to go. But this, again, like the flamethrower teams, this again might be one where I could be swayed to go medium here to save the points.
Okay.
But we skipped over there. One of the big reasons people play Finns, I think, is the sniper team. So the sniper team, like the Sissy Recon squad, it has... So you pay 5 extra points compared to a normal sniper team. It's 55 regular, 72 vet, but it has the Master of the Hunt rule.
Yeah.
So obviously when we do sort of our forward deployment game, one of the things I don't like in forward deployment is if we roll off and I get the higher dice, usually that means I put mine down first. And so I have to choose where my sniper's going. And then if you put yours directly opposite mine, we just end up having a sniper duel, don't we?
Yes.
Which is just a bit tedious. And so often I don't take a sniper team for that reason. But with the Finns, I actually always include a sniper team because in that situation, what I would do is instead of deploying in the house, let's say, or in the ruin, I would deploy behind something dense. And then I would advance into the dense terrain. And then instead of shooting, go into ambush, and then I'm ready to take down anything that runs past me. And if you don't run past me, hopefully I'll get the 4 up at the end of the turn to make my shot anyway. And so it's definitely an auto-include if you're building a Finnish army. Get that sniper in there.
Yeah.
One thing to note, though, with the Finnish sniper is they don't have pistols.
Right, okay. So if they are assaulted, they're not getting tough fighter.
Yeah. So, bit of a shame, to be honest, because every other nation seems to get it, but the Finns don't. But he's still definitely an auto-include.
Yeah, and it's incredibly, reflective of the army and the characteristics and all that sort of stuff.
So one thing I wanted to note with the Master of the Hunt rule is, and it's in the FAQ, it's clarified nicely. When you advance into the ambush, because when you shoot from the ambush, you flip to a fire order, you don't count as moving because it's a fire order you're doing rather than an advance order.
Yeah.
And so, yes, you have moved that turn, but they're such good marksmen, it's like they haven't moved.
Yeah, okay.
And I just want to clarify that because when people first start playing Finns, that's obviously a common enough confusion that it got asked enough times to end up in the FAQ.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Okay.
And so, yes, your snipers hitting on 2 from ambush. Yeah. Very nice indeed.
Yeah. So if we move on to artillery, fairly standard to light artillery, medium artillery, heavy artillery in terms of howitzers, that's all as is.
Yeah, they benefit from the Sisu rule where 50% and they go up a veterancy. So your heavy with the 5 men is going to have to lose 1 more man than your medium to go up to veteran.
Okay, yeah.
Just one thing to consider. Generally, I would run medium,
yeah,
just because I find 3 inches is usually enough. Mm-hmm. But just one thing to note there, that they also benefit from that rule.
They get a few anti-tank guns, so your light, your medium, and your heavy, which was... it's worth noting that the light anti-tank gun has an interesting special rule, improved ballistic.
Yeah, I'm going to be honest, I've never ran an anti-tank gun with the Finns. To be honest, I don't remember the last time I ran an anti-tank gun in bolt action.
No.
Apart from, the 25-pounder I do, but I think of that more as a light howitzer with an anti-tank shell.
So for those of you that do run anti-tank guns, the light anti-tank gun has a special rule, improved ballistic, which means at short range, the M42 ADG adds +1 to its penetration value.
Yeah, so it's strength 5, which is basically a medium anti-tank gun at short range.
And you can mount it on a sledge as though it's on skis.
4 points.
That's a bargain.
I suppose you're paying 1 point per man and then 1 point for the sledge for the actual gun itself.
Yeah.
Can the medium be mounted on skis?
No, it's only the light.
Only the light. So that's a big plus for the light then, isn't it?
Yeah. I can mount my anti-tank rifle on skis on a sledge. I can do the same with my light anti-tank gun. You know where my head is going at this point.
Where's that?
In terms of the next army.
You're going to get a reindeer and run him as a mule.
Yeah, close enough.
60 points for the light one firing as a medium, compared to 75 for the medium with the same number of men. I think if you're going to run an anti-tank gun, run that light one with the 10 points upgrade every time.
If you're going to take an anti-tank gun rather than a howitzer, yeah.
But yeah, just take yourself a medium howitzer for 75 points instead.
And then the last 2 are your anti-aircraft guns. So you can take a light autocannon, which is 50 points regular with gun shield and all the usual rules, or a heavy autocannon, which is the 40mm Bofors, 60 points regular. You don't get the gun shield on that one.
You love a Bofors though, don't you?
I do love Bofors, yeah, but I'm really liking my sledge-mounted light anti-tank gun, if I'm honest. Okay, and then vehicles. So vehicles and Finns, they're not exactly blessed, are they, with a wide range of quality vehicles? Is that fair to say?
I actually disagree.
Okay.
And this is going to be controversial because other commentators have criticised the Finns for their tank selection because one of the things we'll see as we go through is a lot of the vehicles have unreliable, which is a difficult rule because it means every time you take a pin, you take 1 additional pin.
Yeah.
But what that means is your vehicles are very cheap. And because in bolt action, all the tanks are heavily overcosted, actually, if you do a little bit of the old Soviet quantity has a quality of its own, you've got the points there because they're cheaper to take more vehicles.
Yeah.
And yes, one of them might spend a turn not doing much, but if you've got another one, that's fine.
Okay.
And so the one that I really like and the one that I run quite a lot, as long as I've got enough anti-tank elsewhere on my list, I'll run the Vickers.
Yeah.
Now, this one doesn't have unreliable because this was bought before the war, I believe. So they bought these from the Brits, I believe, before the war. So they're well trained on them. They've got the spare parts. And 70 points regular, but you get 2 turret-mounted machine guns, but they're separate turrets. So it's actually got 2 little turrets on the top of it, and they can shoot sort of... It actually doesn't say that they can't shoot across each other, I don't believe.
If they're turret-mounted, they'll be 360, and because they're separate, you can fire at separate targets.
Yes, but because they're mounted alongside each other, So let's say the one on the right wants to shoot something on the left. It would have to shoot through the left turret.
Yeah.
So actually what I tend to do is I try to avoid, like, I don't think I've ever shot left with the right turret.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? Because it just doesn't feel right, because you physically can't turn the turret because the barrel of the machine gun would hit the other turret.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
And so even though the rules is written, both can shoot left or right. I tend never to do it, because the other reason not to do it is the big benefit of this vehicle is it can put 2 pins per turn. So you're not using it to destroy infantry units.
No.
What you're doing is using it to put a pin on 2 infantry units while your other squads are sort of advancing up, going into ambush, putting another pin on. And then the idea is you're sort of doing a rolling advance where you're popping pins on.
And then you're moving into your unreliable vehicles, aren't you? Because these are things that have been captured at some point from the Soviets. So you've got your BT5/BT7 light tank, your T28 medium tank, your T34 medium tank, T34/85 medium tank, your KV1 heavy tank. So all of those are sitting in the armored vehicle tank slot. They're all, though, being penalised because they've got unreliable.
Yeah, well, actually, I think the thing that's really penalising some of these tanks. So if we start with the heaviest of them, the KV1, now they're captured and then they put their best tank crew in them. And so you have to take the KV1 as a veteran.
Okay.
Unreliable. And so because you've taken it as a veteran, it does cancel what I was saying earlier about you getting a point saving by being unreliable. It's expensive. It's 390 points for a KV1.
Yeah.
And again, the T34 suffers the same thing where, so your T34 with the medium is 204 points veteran, but it's unreliable. Your T34
heavy
with the heavy is 252 points. I mean, having said that, taking unreliable tanks veteran is probably the way to go. But basically, thematically, very cool. I don't think it's the end of the world that they're unreliable, because you're veteran and you're paying about the same points as the Soviets are paying for a regular, I believe. So they're not a huge problem. They're not so bad that I would say don't include them ever, but they're not your competitive choices.
No, I'm just reading the entries. So the KV1, 2 were captured. The T34, 5 were captured, and they bought 3 more from the Germans from their excess stock of captured vehicles. It's one of those classic bolt action things where there's like 3 vehicles that ever appeared, but we're going to stick it in the generic list.
Yeah, to be honest, I don't mind that, because I'd rather be able to represent stuff that was rare.
Yeah.
I'd rather they were over thorough than under thorough.
Yeah, no, fair dues. So we've ruled out them. We've ruled out those 3. So if you are going to take a tank for the Finns, I'm guessing it's going to be the T28?
Absolutely, yeah. So the BT5, BT7, it's fine, but it's a light anti-tank gun with a coax MMG. I don't like when you have the 2 weapons where you can only fire 1 at a time.
Yeah.
It's not a huge bargain. It's 120 points veteran, which isn't bad. If you're going to take it, I like the other ones, it's fine. But the T28 is... Now, this is one that I would seriously consider, because you've got a light howitzer with a coax MMG. Then you've got... So let me start counting up my MMGs here. So that's 1. You've then got a turret-mounted MMG covering the front and left arc. That's 2. Then you've got 1 covering the front and right. That's 3. And then you've got 1 pintle-mounted AA MMG. So it's actually got 4 MMGs if you want to fire them. Obviously, I'm saying if you want to fire them, because that pintle one, you might not want to fire, especially because you are unreliable. And so if you open up the hatches and take a pin from rifles, you're taking a second pin straight away.
Okay.
And so if we count that as 3 machine guns that can shoot at 3 separate targets, or 2 machine guns and a light howitzer that can shoot at 3 separate targets, it's very good. I think the Soviets pay 155 points for this one regular, and here the Finns are paying 156 points veteran. So it's comparable in price. It is, if you drive this towards anti-tank assets, it's going to get bogged down, and then they're just going to keep plinking away at you, and you're going to waste the game doing order tests, basically. So what you want to do is you want to play this maybe a little bit more coy, where you keep it on your back lines as a counter-attack unit, or even put it in the outflank and then come in and just last dice of the turn, holds down 4 units with the machine guns and light howitzer. And so this is one that I would seriously consider with the Finns. I don't run it, and the reason I don't run it is purely just because there's so many other good choices that I tend to fill up my points with other stuff first. But it is one that I'm planning to put in a list in the future.
Okay.
So there's 2 other tanks in the selector.
Yeah.
One is the absolute classic Stug. I think everyone loves the Stug, don't they?
Stug life and all that, yeah.
Exactly, yeah.
Which, interestingly, is not unreliable.
It's not, because, again, like with the Vickers, I believe they were supplied them from Germany.
Yeah, they purchased them, didn't they? Yeah.
And so they had time to train on them.
They trained on them, exactly, yeah.
Yeah, they had the time to train on them. They had the supply of parts. And so it's not an unreliable vehicle. It's 230 points regular, but it's a heavy anti-tank gun, medium tank armor 9, and you've got a separate machine gun to shoot out.
Yeah.
So, like some of the other choices, it's not super competitive, but it's certainly not a terrible choice, I would say.
And you can model it with the logs on the side for extra armor protection.
You can indeed, yeah.
Yeah.
And I have played against the Stug recently where it was at an event, and obviously you don't know who you're going to be playing, and someone had brought a Stug and another vehicle, I think maybe it was a Puma or something.
Yeah.
And it was 1,000 points, I believe, and I thought, you've spent a third of your points on these 2 vehicles.
Yeah.
What a waste. And then, of course, I couldn't hurt the Stug, and he kept just moving around the table, just causing like minor mayhem, but sufficiently large mayhem that it was really sort of bogging me down, because that heavy anti-tank gun you can fire as a 2-inch shell, can't you?
Yes. Yeah, you can. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the big benefit of going from a medium anti-tank gun to a heavy anti-tank gun, in my opinion, is you get, instead of that weedy 1-inch shell, you get to go to a 2-inch with D3 pins rather than D2. Your final choice for your tanks is your BT-42. Again, not unreliable, so that's good. 140 points for a medium howitzer, and that's the only thing it's got. So it's a bit like a Priest, really, except it's not open-topped.
It looks like the Soviet one that we refer to as the fridge.
Yeah.
It's basically just got this massive turret stuck on the top of it.
Yeah. The fact that it's turret mounted is a big plus for this tank, I would say. Yeah. Because if someone catches you off guard on the outflank, being able to spin your howitzer is really good.
Yeah.
And also, is that cheaper than a Priest?
What are we on? 140? Yeah, I think it is, yeah.
Okay, so to put him in context, the Priest has 160 points, and it's got a medium howitzer, Pintle HMG, but it's open-topped. And so for 20 points less than a Priest, you lose your heavy machine gun, but you close the hatches down. I actually think that's very... Compared to the Priest, I think that's actually a much better choice.
Yeah, you take something like the Centaur, which is 9+ turret-mounted medium howitzer. That's 190 points. Whoever says the British get everything and don't get any bad units were lying when you start looking at things like this.
I mean, it's purely because the heavy machine gun is incredibly overcosted, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because they've put it down as a 25-point upgrade, which is just insane for 3 shots. So anything that comes with one as standard is just being punished in bolt action, effectively.
So your last 2 armoured vehicles then, you've got your armoured cars, your BA-10 and your BA-20. They're the basic sort of vanilla versions, aren't they? So your BA-10's got your light AT gun with coaxial LMG and a forward-facing LMG. And your BA-20 is just your turret-mounted LMG, so you can't upgrade it with a flamethrower.
But they're both unreliable, to note. Because of that, the BA-10 I never run. It's not a bad choice. 95 points regular, 114 vet. You've got the 2 LMGs and obviously the light anti-tank as well in the coax to the LMG. I tend to run the BA-20 because for 48 points veteran, you can have a turret-mounted LMG in a 7+ recce vehicle. And so you can basically use it just to skirmish around the table, annoying infantry squads. They can't really hurt it because it's armor 7.
Yeah.
If a tank does turn up, you just wreck your way.
To be honest, if a tank's spending its turn firing at a 48-point LMG armoured car, it's also a waste of a shot on behalf of your opponent's tank.
Oh, absolutely. And I do tend to run that veteran because it's only 8 points to upgrade it. It's got unreliable. So if someone does shoot, so let's say I play my Americans against the Finns. If I shoot the heavy machine gun at the BA-20, don't do any damage, but I do 1 pin, I'm going to do a second pin.
Yeah.
And so it's worth being veteran in that case. Equally for things like if you play the British when they do their artillery observer, you're going to take a couple of pins minimum. Having 1 extra pin could really hurt you there. So for 8 points, I tend to recommend taking him veteran. Anything that's unreliable, I'd tend to recommend taking them veteran.
And then we finish off with our transports and tows. We've only got 3. So the truck, standard 12-man truck, it's worth noting that you can't take an MMG on it, unlike other nations.
Yeah, unless you go to the English Open.
Yes.
Because at the English Open, we've added a special rule that says all trucks where you're paying 39 points for your truck, you can add a machine gun. You can jerry-rig a machine gun to the roof because it does feel a bit unfair to the minor nations that they can't put machine guns on trucks.
Yeah, sure. Yep. Your other 2, I'm going to skip the second one. So the third one is the artillery tractor, which is your standard 6+ soft skin tractor, which can tow any gun or howitzer. You can make it armoured, upgrade it to 7+ at an additional 20 points. It's slow and open-topped. But the one that we do see is your T20 Comsommeret. So that's 35 points regular, forward-facing light machine gun, damage value 7+, can transport up to 6 men. It is open-topped and it is unreliable.
Yeah, but it is amazing. It's a unit that doesn't seem that good on paper because it's unreliable and open-topped. But you're paying 42 points veteran. So even if you just think of it as a light machine gun pillbox, armor 7, 42 points, amazing. I would take one every time. But the fact that it can also carry 6 men just adds to how good it is, especially because, as we said earlier, you want to be taking your Finnish infantry in even numbers.
Yes. So I guess if you wanted to take your Jakari squad, for example, 6-man squad, give them SMGs.
Yep.
Give them a couple of Panzerfaust, and then stick them in a Comsommeret. You've got a unit where you can push forward, you can threaten away enemy vehicles because you're Panzerfaust, you're taking them as veteran, you're armed to the teeth with SMGs. So that's a nice little assault combo there.
Yeah, exactly. Basically, any of the infantry, apart from your recon squads, so your Kagapatio and your Sissi, any of the other 3, take them as 6 men and put them in a Comsommeret and you won't regret it, because even your continuation war squad, so the way I tend to run it is I run 6 men, 2 Panzerfaust, put them in a Comsommeret. Even when I'm deploying them on the table, the T20 will advance 9 inches, it'll put a pin on some infantry, the squad inside will get out, put another pin on the infantry. You want to get them out nice and quickly because while they're inside, they're taking that second pin from the unreliable rule every time as well. So what you want to do is you want to move forward and get them out straight away. Move forward to get them out straight away, basically, with each squad. And yeah, it's just such a useful little vehicle. And when you compare it to, let's say, a Bren, where you're paying 50 points base, I believe, for a 5-man transport with an LMG, it's an absolute bargain. And one of the ways I've ran this is if you take 5 of them, then you can make yourself a little shield wall, basically, where you basically create yourself an armor 7 wall that just rolls forward, putting out 5 pins a turn. And then, yes, you'll lose one to, I don't know, the opponent's tank that they paid 250 points for, but not a problem, I've got another 4. And then if one of them gets 2 pins on it and fails its auto test, not a problem, the other 4 are still rolling forward. And so it's very good, especially when taken en masse like that, I would say. Because it's just such a bargain, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And, you've talked before about, for example, when you play your Americans, you'll take inexperienced MMGs because you can basically just stick some pins out. What you've got here is, like you said, a mobile, machine gun box, albeit open topped, but it's so cheap that if you use it in the right way, you can just start dishing pins out.
Yeah, I actually think this might be, because obviously the Soviets have access to this, but they're paying far more points because theirs isn't unreliable. And I actually think, as a veteran, unreliable, it might be one of the best transports in the game, because as long as you play it correctly, where you're not taking pins sort of leading up to dismounting, it's incredibly useful having such a cheap transport.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you put a few in outflank with Fausts in them, or if you did build that SMG squad, put them in outflank, well, they're not taking the pins until they arrive on the table. And then if you've got 3 of them in the outflank, it's only really going to be the first one that gets pinned out. The second and third one, they're armor 7 as well, so the rifles, that rifle squad that went into ambush to counter you, can't really do anything about it other than stop that one unit inside from getting out potentially. But if you've got another 2 rolling in, not a problem.
It's interesting what you said, that, and it's correct in the game, that if you've got a unit transported by your comms on the left, the vehicle takes a pin, it takes an additional pin because it's unreliable, and therefore your passengers take 2 pins rather than 1. Now, that is strictly speaking what it says in the book, in the sense that whenever your vehicle takes a pin, each unit it carries takes the same amount of pin markers. But your unit's not unreliable, it's your transport that's unreliable.
Yeah, but they're just panicking, aren't they?
Well, yeah.
They don't trust the driver. It's every time the vehicle takes a pin, the unit inside takes a pin.
Yeah.
And this one, unreliable. If the vehicle suffers 1 or more pin markers, it automatically suffers 1 further pin marker. So, yeah, so you can't... If you play this badly, this could be the end of that unit's game, basically, because they could end up on sort of like 5 or 6 pins. Well, they'll probably end up on an even number with the unreliable rule. But yeah, they could just end up trapped in that transport. And that has happened to me before, where the British observer, the splash came in turn 2, let's say, and then the squad inside took 3 pins because of the unreliable rule, and then refused to get out, and then they're trapped for another turn, and then the game just sort of continues around them, and you just think, oh wow, this is really frustrating. So there's all of the units, isn't it? So I think we haven't done this before, but I think it might be worth just having a quick glance at the theatre selectors.
Okay.
I don't think it's worth us going through them in depth, but you have 1 for the Winter War, you have 1 for the Continuation War, sort of in 41, and then you have a late war Continuation War selector. And the reason I wanted to go through the theatre selectors for the Finns is there is a special rule in the 44 Continuation War selector, so late war, where you've got captured vehicles as well.
Okay, yep.
So you have the option here where to take a T-37, a T-40, T-50, T-60, T-70, or T-34, KV-8, KV-85, Su-76, Su-85, Su-122, Su-152. So if you do take one of those tanks as a captured unit, it will be unreliable, but you get a 25 points discount on that tank.
That's good. Yeah. I can see in a certain situation. So if you go into an event that's theatre selectors only, like the English Open, A, you're taking a thematic force anyway, but B, you take something like Late War Finns, Continuation War, it could be really flavoursome because you can add in those captured Soviet vehicles. You don't often see Finnish armies anyway, so you're already bringing something a little bit interesting to the mix. Yeah, I'm liking the sound of this a lot.
Yeah, that was the reason why I started the Finns, to be honest, for that exact reason that you don't really see them. Because I think it was probably off the back of a Welsh Open or a similar Open event where I'd faced a lot of either Brits or Germans. Yeah. And I thought, I keep seeing the same forces. It would be quite nice to see something different. And then, of course, I'm playing probably US or Germans at the time. And so I thought, actually, I should probably do that myself. And so that was why I started the Finns, just to try something different. And then obviously found they were quite good. And now I am thinking about bringing them sort of to the competitive side and trying them out in there. I'm not sure they fit my play style, especially, to be honest. Just because you can't have that many flamethrowers.
Yeah, you are severely limited, aren't you? You've only got 0 to 1 flamethrower team. And even though if it's dual platoon, okay, you can take 2. And yes, you can put them in a comsommeret, but you're not going to build a finished barbecue list, are you?
No, absolutely. And so you're very much relying on those tough fighting riflemen to put out pins, with their Panzerfaust to take out tanks. And you're also relying on some of the units that you normally would be using as sort of backline fillers rather than sort of your central units. Things like howitzers, where quite often when I throw a howitzer in, it's just there to sort of like secure the back lines and just put a little bit of pressure on. But actually with the Finns, taking a medium howitzer instead of a light, because you actually are trying to use it as like a key unit there, I think. One of the reasons to highlight the continuation war, late war selector, and one of the things that I want to highlight was usually with the tanks, the unreliable rule sort of a percentage discount, but here unreliable gives you a 25 points discount, and so actually your cheaper tanks are getting a bigger proportional saving, as it were.
Okay.
And so it is a bit of a shame because it means the big tanks that we like to see in the game, there's not a big incentive to run them. There's more of an incentive to run as cheap as possible, because if you're getting sort of a 100 points tank, 25 points off that's a 25% discount. Whereas on something that costs 500 points, that's a 5% discount.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so it's just not worth it. One additional note on that, the crews are always regular and veteran. So in Partisans, when they steal the vehicles, they're always inexperienced crews.
They're always inexperienced, that's right, yeah.
Yeah, whereas here, they're actually regular and veteran, which is, again, really nice for your captured vehicles because it means you get that unreliable discount and you can offset it with a veteran rule. And so you can basically pay the same or potentially less points than the regular reliable version, which is really nice. There is a war in Lapland selector as well. Not hugely noteworthy, other than the only things that can be veteran are the tanks, assault guns, and Kagapartio units.
Okay.
Brilliant. Anything else to note, Phil?
There's one other thing, but it's nothing to do with the army list. I think, Johnny, one of the reasons you don't see Finns very often is also the availability of models, because the Warlord models are very nice, but you can only buy the ski troops or the rifle squad, continuation war rifle squad. And then you've got the other bits like the sniper team and the mortars and the flamethrowers and so on. So they're not widely available from other manufacturers. I know there is a guy who's produced models that you can print, STLs and so on, or you can print on demand. And you often see them kit bashed. And I think I've seen a fair few using the German Blitzkrieg Warlord set. And you need to file off or cut off the gas mask canister on the front. It's on the front of their chest, isn't it? The early war Blitzkrieg, yeah. So you need to get rid of that, but you can use the Blitzkrieg models with some of the arms and so on from the Soviets box set, and you can kit bash some plastic fins using the different Warlord Games box sets available. But yeah, you don't see them because they're quite difficult to get hold of in terms of being able to put interesting units on the table without just buying 5 boxes of continuation war fins and a box of ski troops and saying actually Kakapardio.
Yeah, one modelling note actually is if you do go that route where you're using the German sprues, I would recommend picking up a Soviet weapon sprue, which Warlord sells separately.
Right.
And then you can throw in sort of like Soviet rifles and Soviet SMGs, more importantly. So if your officer has a captured SMG, that sort of really sells the theme that they are Finns rather than just Germans.
Yeah, okay. So you can use the PPSH then, SMGs, yeah. And I guess put in some of the German ones as well, as because they were using some German equipment.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
So, I mean, one of the things I find with the infantry is actually, I think your paint scheme is more important than the equipment when it comes to bolt action, because actually, when you've got your full platoon on the table, the thing you notice is the paint scheme first, don't you? And then it's only when sort of you're really getting in close that you start to notice, oh, look, they've got captured Soviet weapons. That's cool.
Yeah, your 3-foot rule and all that, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's exactly right. I tend to build my armies to a 3-foot rule.
Yeah.
And I'm not particularly fussy with the infantry, as long as they sort of look the part. And then maybe there's a few Easter eggs like that, like the captured weapons. But generally, I find most of the games I've played, my opponent hasn't sort of picked up the models to have a real close look at. They're quite happy just as long as the colour scheme sort of is consistent across the army and they look the part, generally a 3-foot. Most people aren't going to get upset if you're running a K98 where it shouldn't be, etc.
No, fair enough. I think overall I'm quite taken by the Finns, and we have talked about them before, the two of us, in terms of a possible another force for me to play. when I was looking for something to play that was Axis other than Germans, I wanted to, to go with the Italians because they're so, flavoursome and the models are great, but obviously the rules aren't brilliant. And I resisted the Japanese for a long time, and I've obviously ended up, going down the route of getting a Japanese army. But I do quite like the Finns, and the fact that they are, veterans and they dial up to 11 Spinal Tap-esque. They're not, they're not an assaulty force in terms of flamethrowers all over the place and SMGs. I think I might quite enjoy playing them. I'm not about to rush out and buy any, but it may be down the line something I look at fairly seriously in terms of whether or not I can actually find both the models and also a way of making them look interesting on the tabletop in terms of color schemes and mixing and matching and kit bashing and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think you would really enjoy playing them, to be honest. Lots of veterans, lots of nice rules. They can be quite frustrating when you first pick them up, I find, because it's one way you have to remember what your special rules are.
Yeah.
But once you do remember those special rules, they are really good. To the point where I actually think I think they're actually a top 5 army in Bolt Action.
Controversial.
Yeah, indeed. Obviously, we don't see them very often at the competitive events, but that's just because everyone's sort of smitten with Brits at the minute, aren't they? But I actually think at the moment, you've got Japanese, Brits, Soviets.
Yeah.
And then after that, really, you're looking sort of US, really, after that. But I actually think Finns are I think Finns ran by a player who knows what they're doing are far better than US. And I actually think if the US player also knows what they're doing, the Finns might still be better.
Okay. So your challenge now, Jonny, is to go to the next competitive event, not take your US barbecue list, take your Finns and see how you get on.
Absolutely. And this is my plan, I think, long term, just transition to Finns. The problem in the short term is I do love the fast army, whereas the Finns are a little bit slower. You've still got sort of your advance and ambush rule, which is really tasty.
Yeah.
So keeping you on the move. But it's a little bit more slow and sort of traditional lining up and facing off. Yeah, I do think Finns long term might be my big competitive force to see if I can win a big tournament with them.
You heard it here first.
So we hope you've enjoyed listening to us talking about the Finns. We've enjoyed talking about them because it's not an army we get to talk about all that often because it's one of the rarer ones in Bolt Action. And it would be one we'd really like to see at the English Open. So if you haven't bought your ticket yet and you are keen to come to the English Open with your Finns, please do pick up your ticket soon so you don't miss out. As ever, thank you for listening.
Please do like, share, subscribe, and continue to message us and comment on our Facebook posts. It's fantastic hearing from all of our listeners.
Ta-ta for now.
Ta-ta for now.